He killed a slave for breaking a glass, a simple glass cup, then threw the body into a tank of moray eels for entertainment. It happened in the middle of a lavish Roman banquet in front of dozens of elite guests. Blood spread beneath the chandeliers, yet laughter echoed on as if it were nothing more than a joke. And the strangest part, the host wasn't some deranged madman hiding in shadows. He was a respected Roman knight, a model citizen of the empire. That's when a question began to stir in me. Could Roman masters really do anything they wanted to their slaves without facing punishment? We often imagine Rome as a shining civilization of law, philosophy, and breathtaking architecture. But behind those towering marble columns, millions lived without names, without rights, without voices, known by only one thing: they were property. And yet, and this is what I couldn't look away from, Rome was not entirely lawless. There were limits. There were things even emperors couldn't do. But were those limits born of compassion or simply designed to keep a brutal machine running more efficiently? Today I'll take you on a journey to uncover the boundaries that even all-powerful masters couldn't cross. The rare, strange moments when law, fragile though it was, suddenly spoke. And finally, a piercing question for our modern world. Have we truly escaped systems that use people as tools or just change their disguise? Are you ready? Our journey 2,000 years back in time to trace the limits of absolute power begins now. Imagine the sun rising over the hills of Latium sometime around 620 BCE. A soft mist clings to the wheat fields. In the distance, a farmer, an elderly Roman landowner named Gnaeus, guides a wooden plow through the earth. But he is not alone. Two Etruscan slaves walk beside him, hands rough from weeks of labor. These men weren't born into this life. Just months earlier, they were traded for 6 sheep in a backroom deal. There are no chains, no guards, just the steady rhythm of feet pressing into soil and the shared breath of men bound together, not by affection, but by necessity. Slavery in early Rome did not begin with whips or iron collars. It began with law. According to Roman legend, Romulus, the mythical founder of the city, granted Roman fathers the legal right to sell their own children into slavery. This wasn't seen as a moral outrage. It was a matter of survival. If a family fell into debt, the youngest might be sold to spare the rest. Compared to other ancient civilizations, this was a particularly stark choice. While Athens allowed temporary debt bondage and Assyrian law required compensation if harm befell a child slave, early Rome embraced a harsher reality. The child became property, and property could be disposed of. Still, in these early centuries, slavery was deeply personal. The Roman state had not yet exploded across the Mediterranean. Most farms were small, and most slaves were few, sometimes just 1 or 2. Masters and slaves ate from the same pot. They slept under the same roof. They tilled the same dirt. But here's a truth often overlooked: proximity does not equal kindness. What restrained a master wasn't morality, it was fear. The villages of Latium were closely packed. If a slave fled, he could disappear into the next settlement by nightfall. Even worse mistreatment could lead to retaliation. Roman historian Livy tells of a cook who, humiliated in front of guests, stabbed his master in the back the same evening. These were not isolated events. In such a tense dynamic, every beating carried the possibility of vengeance. Every insult, a potential blade in the dark. And so, in the absence of law, early Roman masters learned to set invisible boundaries. Don't beat a slave in the middle of planting season, the harvest might suffer. Don't separate husband from wife, they might cry out. At night, disturb the neighbors, stir unrest. These weren't ethical decisions. They were survival strategies. Quiet, unspoken rules shaped how masters behaved, not out of mercy, but out of caution. Later Roman writers would romanticize this era, imagining a golden age of noble farmers and loyal slaves. But the truth lies somewhere colder. Cato the Elder, writing in the 2nd century BCE, advised landowners to sell any slave who became old, weak, or useless. Yet even Cato warned not to let a slave go to bed hungry. A hungry man cannot plow, he wrote. Feed them just enough to keep the system running, nothing more. That was the early bargain: fuel the body, control the will, extract the labor. But all of this fragile, tense equilibrium was about to collapse. When Rome began to conquer Sicily, Hispania, and Greece, slaves poured into the city not by dozens, but by tens of thousands. The old patterns of shared meals and silent understandings vanished overnight. A new era of slavery was dawning, colder, harsher, inhuman, and Rome would never look the same again. The same fields that greet Aeneas at sunrise could turn murderous after dusk. One spring evening in 496 BCE, the wealthy landowner Publius Lartius, known for boasting that he ruled men the way Jupiter rules thunder, strolled through his kitchen goblet in hand. A humiliated slave named Tiro waited in the shadows. Moments earlier, Lartius had struck him for spilling oil on a marble floor. As household chatter drifted from the triclinium, Tiro stepped forward, pressed a kitchen blade between two ribs, and watched his master crumple without a cry. By dawn, Lartius was a corpse hidden under grain sacks, and Tiro was already halfway to an Etruscan hill town, slipping into a market square among free men who would never question his origins. Livy records the aftermath only in a single line. The household wept in silence, fearing the Senate more than the gods, but the murder rippled through Latium like a whispered threat. Every paterfamilias knew the man who pours your wine can also stop your heart. Geography was the first accomplice. In early Republican Italy, a slave could vanish across one ridge and be received as a stranger in another city-state. No branding, no iron chains, no bureaucratic network of patrols. Masters weighed every punishment against that map in their minds. A lash too many could cost an entire harvest. A public humiliation might travel with a dagger's tip. So invisible, negotiations sprouted like wildflowers between hut and granary door. Finish the threshing today, a master might say, and tonight there will be goat stew. A nod became a contract sealed not by parchment, but by mutual fear of what could happen if either side broke it. Runaways formed silent trails, goat paths that later armies would widen into roads. In coastal marshes, small camps of fugitives bartered fish and salt for news, which villa treated its people worst, which valleys offered safe passage to the Sabines. By 450 BCE, Roman jurists quietly acknowledged this underground highway in the 12 Tables, threatening anyone who harbors a service without rightful claim. The law thundered, but the hills kept their secrets. Modern viewers often imagine early Roman slavery as iron authority and mute submission. Yet the record tells a subtler tale, power diluted by proximity, tempered by the ever-present risk of flight or knife-edge revolt. A master's cruelty had to be calibrated, almost economical. Too soft and pride eroded. Too harsh and the vineyard awoke short of hands, or worse, infused with rage. Across the ocean and 2 millennia later, plantation owners in America's border states would perform the same grim calculus. There, the twisting Ohio River replaced Latium's wooded ridges, but the logic was identical: punish enough to deter, not enough to provoke escape. History, it seems, prefers old tricks and new costumes. Yet every fragile bargain has its breaking point. As Roman legions marched beyond the Apennines, pouring home with caravans of chained prisoners, the countryside's delicate seesaw of fear and familiarity snapped in an instant. The knife in the kitchen became less terrifying when thousands of new bodies could replace a lost cook. A slave's escape, once a nightmare, began to feel like the cost of doing business in an empire overflowing with human spoils. In the next chapter, we will watch that human flood arrive, see how mass conquest transformed intimate terror into industrial cruelty, and why once the numbers swelled, Rome no longer cared if a single pair of feet slipped quietly into the night. The silence broke with the sound of boots, thousands of them crushing the roads that led back to Rome. With every new campaign, Roman generals returned not only with golden grain, but with something even more valuable: people. Human beings by the tens of thousands, dragged in chains from Sicily, Hispania, Carthage, and Greece. The Republic, once a modest farming society with a few household slaves per villa, had awakened into an empire fueled by human spoils. By the 2nd century BCE, the numbers were staggering. Historians estimate that up to 1/3 of Italy's population were slaves. In urban centers like Rome, it was even higher. What began as personal servitude had mutated into mass production. The old model of a master knowing each slave by name was gone. In its place stood the cold mathematics of labor. How many could a field hold? How many gladiators would survive the month? How many miners would die before the next shipment? The transformation was brutal and deliberate. On Sicily's vast latifundia, slaves worked in iron collars, tilling endless fields for absentee Roman landlords. In Spain's silver mines, they descended into darkness each morning, shackled and blindfolded, often never to emerge. On the outskirts of Rome, entire compounds were built to house breeding slaves, women forced to bear children who would be born into chains, never having known another fate. The system had become so large, so impersonal, that the individual disappeared. The slave was no longer a person, he was a statistic, a line in a ledger. And yet the cruelty wasn't born from sadism, it came from efficiency. Take the gladiator schools, for example. Known as ludi, these were not mere training grounds. They were meat factories. Slaves, prisoners, and criminals were fed, trained, and sharpened like blades for public entertainment. A gladiator's value was calculated with cold precision: how many fights before death, how much income from tickets and bets, when to replace him. It wasn't just about labor. Rome commodified every part of the enslaved body. Greek slaves educated Roman children. Nubian slaves served as exotic decorations in elite households. Young boys and girls were trafficked for sex. Elderly slaves, no longer useful, were either sold cheaply or abandoned. And yet the legal system remained silent. There was no protection, no recognition, no limit, only ownership. Modern viewers often struggle to comprehend how such a sophisticated empire could thrive on such dehumanization. But to the Romans, slavery was not a necessary evil, it was the natural order. Philosophers like Aristotle had laid the groundwork centuries earlier, arguing that some people were slaves by nature. Roman elites simply took the idea to its logical, terrifying conclusion: if slaves were tools, then you use them until they broke. Still, the system had its cracks. As numbers swelled, the state grew nervous. Slave revolts began to flare, like brush fires, small at first, then deadlier. The most famous, Spartacus's rebellion in 73 BCE, would shake the republic to its core. But before that storm erupted, Rome basked in what it thought was control. It's important to pause here and understand what had truly changed. In early Rome, cruelty was a choice. Now it was protocol. Slaves didn't sleep beside their masters anymore. They slept in rows in locked quarters, with dogs patrolling the fences. The intimate terror of rebellion had been replaced by systemic brutality, a cruelty so routine, so industrial, that even the pain became predictable. And that predictability, that dangerous sense of order, would lull Rome into believing that its empire, like its slaves, would never rebel. But history had other plans. To understand how Rome sustained its vast machinery of slavery, we must walk into its most sacred space, not a temple, but a courtroom. Here, in the polished silence of marble halls, scrolls were unrolled, oaths were spoken, and verdicts were etched into history. And within those verdicts, one cold truth endured: a slave was not a person, he was a thing, a res. The Roman legal mind was brilliant, meticulous, and merciless. In the Institutes of Gaius, an essential Roman legal textbook from the 2nd century CE, the distinction is laid out with chilling clarity. All entities under Roman control were divided into two categories: persona, persons, and res, things. Slaves, despite their breath and blood, belonged firmly to the second. This meant they had no legal standing. They could not marry. They could not own property. They could not testify in court unless tortured first, because only under pain, the law reason, could a slave be trusted to tell the truth. In the eyes of the Republic and the Empire alike, a slave was a talking tool, a living asset, no more protected than a cart or a cloak. The legal implications were vast. If a master killed his own slave, no court intervened. There was no charge of homicide, only loss of property. But if a neighbor killed another man's slave, restitution was required, not to honor the slave's life, but to compensate the owner. The value of the slave was measured like livestock. If he was strong, skilled, or young, the fine was higher. If old or sickly, it was reduced. Human worth calculated by productivity. This may sound barbaric to modern ears, but Rome prided itself on legal order. It wasn't chaos, it was structured dehumanization, wrapped in logic and tradition. Even their terminology betrayed the rot at the core. A slave could be bought per assem, sold at auction beside cattle branded on the forehead, with initials of ownership. Contracts involving slaves included clauses about warranty, as if purchasing a faulty tool. If a buyer discovered that a slave was epileptic, rebellious, or had attempted escape before he could return the goods and demand a refund. What's more striking is what Roman law never did. It never asked why. Nowhere in the 12 tables in Cicero's orations, or even in the late imperial codes, does Roman law question the morality of owning another human being. It questioned efficiency, cost inheritance, but never the foundation itself. Even the most progressive emperors left this architecture untouched. We see a twisted echo of this logic centuries later in the American South, where slave codes treated people as chattel and legal documents debated whether a mother's status passed to her children like a bloodline or a brand. The roots of that coldness lie here in the scrolls of Roman jurists, who transformed violence into bureaucracy and moral silence into law. And yet, the law did not exist in a vacuum. Occasionally a crack appeared. When a master's cruelty became so extreme that it offended the sensibilities of the elite or threatened public order, the system responded. Not for the sake of the slave, but for the sake of Rome's reputation. But these were exceptions, decorated outliers, legal anomalies wrapped in ceremony and forgotten the next day. The enduring truth was this law did not restrain the Roman slave system, it refined it. Like a whetstone, it sharpened the boundaries between property and person, codified control, and insulated the powerful behind layers of logic. The question is not why Rome allowed such a system. The better question is, how many societies since have copied it without even knowing next? We'll watch what happens when that legal silence is broken, not from compassion, but from fear. As rebellions begin to rise and emperors start to worry, the law will for the first time start drawing lines, not to protect the slave, but to protect the empire from itself. One summer afternoon in 22 BCE, the knight Vettius Pollio hosted a dinner meant to dazzle Rome's finest. His villa overlooked the Tiber, glittering with imported crystal goblets, so thin guests claimed you could read poetry through the glass. Mid-course, a young slave stumbled, and one of those priceless cups shattered on the marble floor. Pollio's face did not redden, it chilled. He ordered the boy thrown into a pool stocked with lampreys trained to tear human flesh. The guests fell silent until someone else spoke. Augustus Princeps of Rome calmly rose from his couch. Without raising his voice, he commanded the boy released. Then he turned to a steward. "Bring every crystal goblet you find." One by one, Augustus smashed them on the mosaic tiles. Shards sparkled like fallen stars. If a cup can be replaced, he told Pollio, so can mercy. The emperor wasn't preaching compassion. He was staking out the boundaries of spectacle. Violence belonged to the state, not to private whim. That gesture was the first public crack in Rome's facade of limitless mastery, but it was only a signal. True limits arrived 4 decades later with the Lex Patronia of 61 CE. The law forbade owners from sending their slaves into the arena to be devoured by beasts without a magistrate's consent. To modern ears, it sounds humane. In truth, it secured the emperor's monopoly on theatrical death. Executions were powerful propaganda, and Nero, like Augustus, wanted every roar of the crowd to echo the grandeur of the throne, not the caprice of a private citizen. Then came Claudius. A practical man, he noticed that sick or aging slaves were simply dumped to die on Rome's streets, a public eyesore that hinted at disorder. His edict ruled that if a master abandoned a sick slave, and that slave somehow recovered, perhaps through the charity of neighbors, freedom was automatic. Burial costs, too, became the owner's legal duty. Claudius did not argue that slaves were human souls. He argued that corpses in doorways bred disease, and that healthy, freed ex-slaves were less dangerous than resentful, half-dead ones. Historians sometimes point to these laws as the dawn of abolitionist feeling in Rome. They misunderstand the motive. Each statute was a tourniquet tightened not around cruelty, but around chaos. Pollio's lampreys threatened elite decorum. Unregulated arena killings threatened imperial theater. Rotting slaves threatened public hygiene. Every reform protected the machine, not the cogs. Yet even symbolic chains can rattle the mind. For the first time, a master needed permission to stage a private blood show. He owed a debt, however small, to a slave on his deathbed. Invisible walls began to rise between impulse and action. They were thin, paper thin, but they existed, and paper in the hands of Roman jurists could prove sharper than iron. The empire, though, was still a long way from justice. Killing a slave with a whip, starving him, slowly driving him past exhaustion, none of that pierced the legal veil. Augustus and Claudius had merely trimmed the ragged edges of cruelty, leaving the fabric intact. And Rome's elites quickly learned how to fold those new rules into contracts, carve loopholes, and keep the profits flowing techniques so sophisticated they feel eerily modern. In our next chapter, we will open those contracts line by line and watch how a single sentence could decide whether a woman was sold into a brothel or promised eventual freedom, all without challenging the system that called her property in the first place. Picture a dusty market square in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, 142 CE. A Roman tax official sits behind a cedar desk stylus, poised over a sheet of papyrus. Before him stands a middle-aged broker named Marcus, ready to finalize the sale of a 12-year-old girl called Philotera. The price 200 denarii. Yet what truly matters is a single sentence. Marcus dictates slow and crisp, ne prostituatur. Let her not be prostituted. If any future owner violates the clause, Philotera is to be freed immediately and registered as the former seller's freedwoman. The ink dries. A clerk rolls the contract, seals it with wax, and files it among hundreds of others, quiet proof that Rome, for all its brutality, reveled in paperwork. We tend to imagine slavery as raw muscle and iron shackles, but by the High Empire it also spoke in legal Latin, inscribed by men who never dirtied their hands. Ownership had become a sophisticated compliance regime, more Wall Street than battlefield. These private covenants could be astonishingly detailed. Ne manumitatur. The buyer must never grant the slave freedom. Ut manumitatur post annus decim. The buyer must free the slave after 10 years of service, no earlier, no later. Ut exportatur. The slave must be taken out of Rome within 30 days and forbidden to return on pain of automatic re-enslavement. Breach the clause and a magistrate could impose fines, confiscate property, even strip Roman citizenship. Not because the state cared about the slave's fate, but because contracts were the arteries of commerce, and commerce was the empire's pulse. Break the rules, threaten the pulse. Some clauses read like modern non-compete agreements. A senator might sell his household tutor with a line barring the new owner from leasing the man to a rival family. Intellectual property protection, first-century style. Others mirrored corporate benefit plans. One parchment discovered at Dura Europos promises a skilled scribe freedom and a small pension at 50, provided he trains 2 replacements first. Yet none of this softens the cruelty, it systematizes it. The clauses serve the reputations of sellers, the investments of buyers, and the smooth flow of profit. Philotera may be spared a brothel, but only because someone upstream wishes to avoid scandal. Slavery becomes a lattice of risk management strategies, a human supply chain governed by red ribbons and wax seals. Roman jurists took pride in enforcing these micro-protections with near-fanatical rigor. In one surviving court record, a judge scolds a buyer who forced a seamstress on night shifts contrary to a contract specifying day work only. The ruling paid damages and manumit the woman, not for her dignity, but for breach of warranty. The machine ran on promises. Promises had to hold, and the slaves, they learned the clauses by heart, the way modern workers memorize HR manuals. A young man sold with ut manumitatur might count the days to liberation, clinging to a hope written in ink, hope that could vanish if the papyrus was lost or a bribe changed hands. Paper shields are thin. This corporate sheen fooled some Roman philosophers into calling the system enlightened. On parchment it looked orderly, almost compassionate. But step beyond the notary's door, and nothing had changed. The mines still swallowed men alive. The latifundia still flogged field crews at dawn. Contracts merely greased the gears, and sometimes even wax seals snapped under pressure. When a master ignored a clause or a promised freedom, evaporated anger spread through slave quarters faster than plague. Small grievances fused into conspiracy, and quiet nights birthed whispers of revolt. The paperwork that once lulled Rome into confidence would soon enough feed a very different ledger, one measured in torches and blood. Night has always been the slave's accomplice. In 198 BCE, on a lonely road near Capua, torches flared where none should be, and a patrol of legionaries found 30 runaways gathered around a dead overseer. His throat slit, his whip still dangling from one hand. Rome called it a disturbance. The fugitives called it an answer. Within days, they vanished into the Apennines, leaving vineyards smoldering, and a rumor pulsing through every villa: the tools were learning to strike back. For the next 2 centuries, flickers of revolt lit the map like sparks in dry grass. Sicily, 135 BCE, thousands of plantation slaves, starved past reason, crowned a Syrian shepherd king, and seized the grain ports, forcing Rome to dispatch consuls, as if quelling a foreign nation. 24 CE on the island again, another uprising. The Senate recorded it in one chilly line, then voted another mass crucifixion. Yet no decree, no row of crosses could erase the image of shackled men breaking their chains and turning plowshares into spears. Rome's answer was terror codified. Nowhere is that clearer than in the case of Pedanius Secundus, city prefect, murdered by one of his own servants in 61 CE. Secundus's townhouse overlooked the forum. His status was armor, or so he believed. At dawn, neighbors heard a shout cut short. By dusk, the Senate debated his death in marble halls, heavy with incense and dread. One slave had wielded the blade, yet Roman law inscribed centuries earlier to discourage conspiracy demanded the execution of every slave under that roof, nearly 400 souls. Women who cooked his meals, children who polished his sandals, old men who could scarcely stand. The debate crackled with fear disguised as reason. Stoic senators pleaded that collective guilt mocked justice. Hardliners replied that mercy mocked survival. Spare them, one elder warned, and every master in Rome will sleep with a dagger at his neck. The motion passed. Within a week, the entire household was marched beyond the Esquiline Gate. Cassius Dio notes that crowds gathered to protest, only to be driven back by soldiers lining the road, their shields glinting, hostile under a noon sun. 400 bodies hung in rows, a grisly arithmetic lesson. One dead master equals 400 dead slaves, interest paid in blood. These spectacles worked until they didn't. Each mass punishment fed an underground river of rage coursing through barracks and kitchens. Whispered songs chronicled martyrs. Clandestine meetings mapped escape routes. By the time Spartacus shattered a gladiator barracks in Capua in 73 BCE, the empire had already fertilized the soil of rebellion. He merely reaped the storm. For 2 years, his army of former field hands and arena fighters roamed Italy, defeating consular legions, cracking the myth of Roman invincibility. Only overwhelming force and the promise of crucifixion for every captured rebel stemmed the tide. Yet Rome learned the wrong lesson. Instead of loosening the vice, it forged new spikes, stricter patrols, harsher branding, faster crucifixions. Fear kept the wheels turning, but it also ground the gears. Each crackdown made the machine more brittle, the slaves more desperate, the rebellions more brutal when they erupted again. Behind palace walls, philosophers began to ask uneasy questions. If terror is the only chain, what happens when terror dulls? Could the empire survive its own cruelty? In our next chapter, we will eavesdrop on those thinkers. Seneca, Justin, and an emperor named Constantine, who tried to clothe domination in ethics and edicts and discover why fine words could not cleanse blood already soaked into Rome's foundations. In the candlelit study of his villa on the Bay of Naples, Seneca, the younger, dipped a reed pen into ink and wrote a sentence that would echo far beyond his own lifetime. Remember when you dine that the man who pours your wine is a fellow man. Stoic wisdom. The textbooks call it a reminder that virtue demands kindness. But Seneca's letter was addressed to Lucilius, an equestrian who owned dozens of slaves. The philosopher's appeal was not a call for emancipation. It was a management memo. Treat your property well, he hinted, and it will serve you better. Across Rome, other voices rose with bolder tones. Small gatherings of Christians shared bread and wine, insisting that in Christ there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. Baptism, they said, washed hierarchy away. Yet their sermons echoed in catacombs, not courthouses. Most converts kept their households intact, praying beside men and women still bound in chains. Doctrine soared, daily life trudged on. Then in 319 CE, Emperor Constantine issued an edict that sounded revolutionary. Killing a slave would be punished like killing a free person. Imperial scribes copied the law onto purple parchment, sealed it with gold, and paraded it through the streets as proof that Rome now walked a higher road. But the fine print told a different story. Only manifest homicide, stabbing, strangling, hurling from a cliff, feeding to beasts counted as murder. If a slave died beneath a whip or rotted away from overwork, no crime had been committed. The parchment shield glittered in sunlight and tore in the first hard wind of reality. Why did paper promises fail? partly because philosophers and preachers aimed for hearts while Rome's economy ran on backs. A single latifundium could require 500 laborers, a silver mine 1,000. Shutting down cruelty meant shutting down profits, and neither Senate nor sermon could stomach that cost. So elites adopted the language of mercy while tightening the screws of discipline. Be humane urged moralists, then tacked on a clause provided the harvest is not delayed. Yet words have a way of squirming out of their cages. Seneca's fellow man creed slipped into Christian liturgy. Christian equality seeped into imperial rhetoric. Constantine's edict tattered though it was planted a seed. Over centuries, these fragile notions would sprout into sturdier claims that every soul bears an image of the divine, that law should guard the weak from the strong, that work and worth are not the same. Still in the 4th century, such ideas were faint perfume over a battlefield. Slaves continued to die in quarries. Overseers continued to wield iron, certain the state would look away. The gap between parchment and practice yawned wide enough to swallow whole generations. If this sounds familiar, it should. Modern corporations publish glossy sustainability pledges, while garment workers faint in locked factories. Governments sign human rights conventions, even as prisons overflow. We have inherited Rome's talent for noble language paired with brutal math. Night settles over a Jamaican sugar estate, 1765. In the field house, an overseer opens a weather-stained ledger titled Act for the Better Ordering of Slaves. Its clauses feel eerily familiar. A master who maims his own slave must pay a fine, unless the injury occurred in the course of correction. 2 millennia after Rome, the parchment shield still glitters. The loophole still yawns. Cross the Atlantic, Virginia, 1669. Legislators draft the casual killing of slaves statute. If a slave dies under extreme punishment, no felony is committed. Roman jurists would have nodded in approval. Only the ink has changed. Move forward again, Alabama, 1898. Convict leasing contracts sell black men to coal mines for trivial charges. The paperwork demands employers provide adequate food and shelter, but offers no penalty when bones surface in shallow graves. Res not persona echoes through the red clay. Even today, supply chain audits for cobalt or cotton read like glossy versions of Claudius's edicts, pledges of health care, voluntary overtime, freedom to leave, so long as production targets are met. Compliance teams tick boxes, workers collapse in hidden corridors. Rome's legal ghost hovers over the spreadsheet. What history whispers? 1. Power writes the rules and the exceptions. Token protections serve stability. First humanity, second. Nuance matters because systems endure when villains look reasonable. Your turn to look closer. How many objects in your home phone, shirt, wedding ring pass through hands called assets on somebody's balance sheet? Choose one. Trace its journey. Share what you discover in the comments with the tag Still Persona. Let's crowdsource the map Rome never drew. Because the reckoning is ours now. No emperor will smash the goblets for us. No parchment will close the loopholes if we don't read the fine print aloud. The past does not chain us, but it does draft our contracts unless we pick up the pen. Will we? That decision writes the next chapter. One still blank, still fragile, still waiting for a different kind of ink.